Hello, everybody. This video is coming after the fact because one of you students nicely had told me afterwards that the video I recorded for this week's online class was choppy and really hard to follow. So I hope this video is much clearer and easier to follow. Okay, everybody. So from our website, as I mentioned in the video during the live class, from our classes website, this week's agenda is to complete looping by essentially completing looping problem 4. And I'm also going to show how to do it in the alternative assignment version. Okay. When I did this live in class, I went and keyed in the code step by step. Today, what I'm just going to do is just go over the code step by step, and give you a chance to follow if you're following this video, obviously after the fact. The video I've put up here will be replaced with the new video I'm making right now. From last Tuesday's, because of the holiday, it was on last Tuesday, that video. So this is the looping problem we're talking about, the rocket racing game, the final assignment of the looping unit, the final programming assignment, I guess other than the case study. This is the video that was online that I'm going to remove from our website and instead bring the one in that we're doing now. And I definitely will be going over the alternative version of this looping assignment, which if you go through the alternative assignments to would be this one right here, problem 4. Okay, so here is the design for this. Okay, obviously there would be two actual rocket images there and a bunch of little controls for the user to use. There's also a label right here. That's hard to see, but it's right in there. All right, so the first thing we did is we went into the code for form load, but then before we write any code for form load, we added a global variable for the cache in this program. We made it a double so it could store decimal numbers, and as the program problem describes, we start off the cache at $100. Then we went to form load. When the program loads or launches, we wanted to have a few things change. This first line right here, where I set the label of the cache, does not have to be in such a fancy format if you want. It does not have to be this. If you want, it could just be a simple, like a $sign in quotes, and then added to that the cache variable, and then the semicolon. Okay, that would be fine. But what I did is I used something which actually comes from one of the hints on the assignment. If you go down to the bottom of the first page, there is some hints down here of things you could do to solve this problem. And one of them is this hint right here that you could format what appears in that label to look like cache. So it adds a $sign, it puts it to 2 decimal places, all that. As we're getting near the end of this course, I wanted to throw in a few little extras here just to kind of get some of you ready for a final assessment. Okay, now those are just the first set of hints. On the second page of this assignment, as I mentioned when I did this live in class, is a much larger set of hints that kind of walk you through how to possibly solve this problem. That's also what I'm doing right now. Okay, so when the form loads, set the label to be a cache format. And just one second. Okay, I'm back. And so yeah, that takes care of the label for the cache. And what these lines are doing is adding the words rocket 1 and rocket 2 to our combo box. I'm also putting a 10 into the text box that has the bed in it. And I'm also putting the word rocket 1 into the text of the combo box. Just to show you, I'm just going to run this so you can see what those few lines have done, is they just set up the program for sort of a starting sort of space here. So they're not completely necessary to put in all of those lines, but what they're doing there is it's putting a $10 in the bet. That way I know that the bet isn't just automatically empty. I could hit race right away. It's putting the money into that label, and into the combo box right here, it's putting the words rocket 1 into the text right at the start, and then it's also putting the words rocket 1 and rocket 2 into the items in the drop down. And that's what those lines of code are doing, right? That's what adding it to the items means it's putting it in the drop down. However, putting it in the text means it's there right away. Okay. Then the remainder of what we worked on was all based on the start race button. Of course, we also did the exit button. That's an easy one, right? Like we just said, exit the program. But now let's take a look at what happens when I click start. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the bet, out of the text box and store it in a string variable. Okay, I'm just going to temporarily store it in a string variable. Okay. I am also going to get which rocket they chose, store it in a string variable by pulling the text out of the combo box as well. So the user will select something in the combo box and they will type something into the text box. And whatever those things are, I will store them in those two variables. Then I'm going to check them both. What I mean by that is, if they didn't put anything in the text box, I can use the label that I have. I could also use a message box to tell them to enter a bet. Okay, so if they put nothing in that text box, and I just want to show you how that would look, right? So instead of the $10 that they'd put in here, if they left it empty with nothing in there and they hit start race, then it's going to say to them, you know what, you didn't put anything in this, so please enter a bet. The next thing I'm going to check is that they actually picked a rocket up here. Okay? So the next part of the if, which I've actually made an else if, is if their choice is nothing, then I'm going to tell them to choose a rocket. And again, I'll show you how that essentially would look. So if they had nothing here, when they said, okay, I'm going to race, it would again say choose a rocket because there's nothing in here. Okay, so that's just a little check. But now, if both of those are okay, I can move on to the remainder of the code. So now that thing that was in the text box, I'm going to convert it into a number representing how much they're betting. Because cash is a number, bet is a number. I'm going to do some math later on. So I want to turn everything into a number here. Okay, now that I've checked it. But the other thing I'm going to check about the bet is to make sure that they're not betting more than how much cash they have. And again, I'm just going to say that you can't bet more than you have. Let me show you how that would look. So if it gets to that point in the code and they bet $200, right? They only have 100 right here, and they're betting 200, and I click start race. It says you can't bet more than the $100 that you have, right? That's you can't do that. Okay. But if that's okay, the bet, moving on, what I'm going to start with is setting up the rockets into a starting position. And by that I mean right now in the design of this form, these two rockets are set in a position. That was easy when I designed it. I could use my mouse to move them around. If I select one of these and go to the properties window, under the property called location, the Y value represents the up-down value. Right now, the way I designed this, the number I found it worked at was 270. When you're designing yours, you'll have to look at your own design to see what your number is. Okay? So my number is 270. And so that's why I've set this up to say the starting line will be 270. It's actually called TWIPs, or another way to think of it is pixels, right? So it's just a little spot on the form, 270 pixels from the top. They're going to race up, so this thing is going to go up to the top, and obviously that's going to change its location to a different number. In this case now it would be like 21. It's going smaller. As I get up and up and up and up, it's going to eventually get so small it's going to reach 0, which would represent the top, right? So let's put that back. And that's why I created a second one to represent where it hits the finish. Do you need these two constants? No, you could actually just put the numbers right in the code, but it's just a better way to program by setting up these constants ahead of time. All right, then I'm going to move the picture boxes just so you can see how things move. And this is from our notes. But what you can do is instead of changing the location and the Y value, which is very math oriented, another way you can do it is to change something in C# called the top of that picture box. Top represents the top portion of it. So I can set it to this number, 270. Now I realize it's already there. So what's the point? What's the point of putting it at the starting line when it's already there? Well, that's because this program just started. But every time after I race the first time, I want to set them back to the starting line for the very next race. So that's what I'm doing right there. All right. Now, the next thing our code's going to need is we want them to move randomly. If they all move the exact same amount, it's not really a race. So to generate random numbers, we use the good old line that we've used since our last unit to generate random numbers eventually. How much do I move them? So for that, I'm going to make a little minimum and maximum number. Don't worry about this one right now. To represent that theoretically they could move 0 pixels all the way up to 30 pixels. I mean, it's only 270 pixels. So if I made the maximum too big, that's going to jump way too much at once. Again, with your program, you can certainly change these numbers into kind of anything you want, including even making this number a negative number if you want. That can kind of make a neat little effect where it kind of backs up a little bit in the race. All right. Then comes the actual piece of the code that involves looping. So finally, here's where we're going to use a while loop. And what this loop is saying is while the top of rocket 1 is greater than the finish line, and remember that's what that means. That means the word and. And means both of these things have to be true for the loop to continue. So I'm saying while rocket 1 is not at the finishing line and rocket 2 is not at the finishing line, keep moving those rockets. Okay? So that's the code there. And I want to sort of pause there again to give you guys a chance, if you're following this after, to look at that loop. This really could all be one line of code. I just put a little break in right there just so it all fits on the screen nicer. Okay? And then inside the loop, what I did was I made a piece that moves each rocket by subtracting a random number between 0 and 30. That's the minimum and the maximum. So it subtracts that number a little bit each time. Both rocket 1 and 2 subtract a different random number. It keeps generating a different random number to move each time. Okay, now let me explain what this code does. This is optional code. It's actually not in the hints. What this code does is it actually slows down the loop itself, because with the computers it can tend to go so fast you don't even notice that they're moving. So what this little special line of code does is it essentially puts the computer to sleep for a certain amount of time, which is what this variable up here was. And that time variable is measured in milliseconds. Milliseconds is an interesting unit of time. There are 1,000 milliseconds equals 1 second of real time. So when I say 100 up here, what I'm talking about is a tenth of a second. So I'm slowing it down a tenth of a second. Anyways, I want to show you how that looks at this point. Pause again for a sec. Okay, I'm back. So here's that form again, and let's see what a race would look like. You can see that the rockets are slowly moving up a random amount a little bit at a time. Okay? And you will see this effect called artifacting, where you sort of see sort of a shadow of it being there until the race is done. That's just the nature of the problem we're solving. Normally, you wouldn't necessarily use a loop to do a real animation in some sort of a game, but this is a good way to teach looping to you guys. All right, so with the loop done, we now need to figure out who won this race. That's the next piece of the code we're going to look at. So first thing we're going to check is if we have a tie in place. The tie is used by putting the if statement like this. If rocket1.top is, now this is really important, less than or equal to. In the loop, we were saying greater than the finishing line because we wanted them to move. But now it's less than or equal to the finishing line, then it's a tie. If both of those, again using and, are true, if rocket 1 is less than the finishing line and rocket 2 is less, then we have a tie, which is possible. It's possible because they move random amounts that they both reach the finish line at the same time. And so that means no money is awarded. But then the next piece will be, well, what if it's just rocket 1 that gets to the finishing line? So it's the same, less than or equal to there. Rocket 1 has 1. Okay, so first thing I check is a tie. Now I'm going to check if it's just rocket 1 that's reached the finishing line. Okay, but is this who the user bet on? Did the user bet on rocket 1? Because if they bet on rocket 1, then they won. But if they bet on rocket 2, then they lose. So the inside of that else if, okay, is another if statement that says if the choice, remember that was a variable we got earlier on, equals rocket1. And I just want to make a note right here that the way you put it inside of quotes here has to be exactly the same way you put it, oops, when you added it right here, including any capital R's, any spaces. It has to be exactly the same spelling for this to work. Okay? All right, so back to where we were there. So if they chose rocket 1, then I award them double the bet. So the cash equals what it was plus 2 times the bet. So I times the bet by 2, and then I show them in the label the result of this that says rocket 1 wins and you win. But then I also have an else to that if. The else says, well, wait a minute. If they didn't pick rocket 1, then they lose. So I subtract the bet. I don't subtract double the bet. And so then I say rocket 1 wins, just like I did up here, but I say you lose, not you win. Okay? Then I repeat all of this code again for rocket 2. So rocket 2 uses the exact same else if code. So now it's rocket 2 up here. The choice is rocket 2. I say rocket 2 wins. Okay? But other than that, it's essentially the exact same code. So you can certainly copy and paste it and modify it. If you're following this after the fact, you can just look for these little spots right here, here, and here that actually need to change for rocket 2. So I'm just going to back up the code a little bit so you can see. I know it's harder to read now, but okay. So this is the else ifs I'm talking about, right? Else if rocket 1 is across the finish line, else if rocket 2 is across the finish line. Okay? And the first part of that if statement was based on if it was a tie. Finally, the last piece of this problem, just this last little piece right here inside that start race button, was to, now that I've changed how much cash they have, I'm going to once again display that in the label. So I just copied and pasted this line out of form load. We already had it in form load. And then the very last piece of code is one last if statement to see if their cash is less than 0. If it is, I give them a message box saying game over, and I exit the program. All right, let's try this out. I'm going to bet all of it. $100 on rocket 1. I'm out of money. It's game over. You can see here rocket 2 I lost. Cash went down to 0. Game over. All right. One second. My apologies. Okay, final thing with this is now that we've finished this, I want to show how this would look in the alternative assignments. So for those of you doing it this way. So same thing, I'm just going to scroll through this slowly to give you an idea about what we're looking at here. So with this program, it's the same idea. You start with a double, except now to get their bet, instead of using a text box, we use a console write line and then a console read line to read it in. So we say, hey, enter a bet, then read it in. We do the exact same thing with their rocket choice. We do a write line and a read line. When we check both of those, it's the same if statement, but again, we're using write line instead of changing a label. The else is exactly the same. The getting the bet is exactly the same. The checking the cash is exactly the same. But if there's a mistake, instead of using the label, we use write line again. The constants are the same. And now, instead of moving picture boxes, instead what I'm going to do is use 2 integers right here to track the location of each rocket. So rather than use the picture box, I make an integer called rocket 1 and an integer called rocket 2. But then I use a random number generator again. I use a minimum and maximum again. I don't have to worry about sleep because that doesn't matter in this program. I'm not going to put anything to sleep in the race. I did do a write line here that just says begin race. That's just an extra thing The while loop now uses just rocket 1 and rocket 2. It doesn't use dot top because there's no picture box to move. The random number just uses rocket 1 and rocket 2 instead of, again, worrying about the top. And I've added 2 lines inside the loop to display where rocket 1 and rocket 2 are as it moves through the loop. Because, again, you can't visually see it in this alternative assignment. Then determining a winner is basically the same code, except instead, again, of using dot top, I use rocket 1 and 2. And instead of using a label, I use console.writeLine. So that changes there. That changes right there. But other than that, the code would be identical to what I showed with the C# Visual Studio version. Again, the else statement would be slightly different by saying WriteLine here, here, and here. But the if and the else if would be the same. And the last little piece of code, once again, uses WriteLine to show the cache and uses WriteLine when the game's over. And let's just run this to show you how this would look. I'm going to run this right off a website, not using Visual Studio at all. Trying to anyways. Come on. There we go. I'm going to bet $10. And it's running a little sluggish. In the meantime, I'm just going to shut this down in the background. Maybe the computer's trying to do too much. Oh no, my internet shut down. Hang on one sec, that's why. Reconnected. Little musical interlude here as we wait for my computer to try to get reconnected to the internet. So many pauses today. Try this one. I got 2 internet locations I can check here. Let's see if this one, no internet. Oh, great. Let's shut this video down one more time. Anyways, you know what? I'm going to wrap that video up today. Just trust me that the code works. And thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next week.